Oh my God. What have I done?
12 years is a long time to love someone without knowing who they really are. Julian Cole believed he understood every corner of his marriage, every quiet compromise, every late night his wife Adriana spent away from home. He told himself it was consulting work, spreadsheets and client calls, nothing more. He never once imagined that the woman who made his coffee every morning was the same woman who had quietly built one of the largest fashion empires in the world, a $5 billion label called Noir Atelier, hidden behind lawyers, holding companies, and a name she never let touch her own. He thought he knew his wife completely. He was about to learn that the person closest to him had been a stranger the entire time, and that the empire he was standing inside, the one about to make headlines, belonged to her. Tonight was supposed to be simple. A runway show, lights, cameras, applause, the kind of night Julian had attended a dozen times before without asking too many questions. He stood near the entrance in his tailored suit, checking his phone, rehearsing in his mind the story he would tell his wife about where he had been earlier that evening. He had no idea that in exactly 10 minutes, the portrait meant to honor the woman who founded this company, his own wife, was about to be replaced on a massive screen in front of 900 guests. He thought he was protecting a secret. He had no idea he was about to expose one that would destroy everything he built his double life on. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Somewhere backstage, a young model named Vanessa Lane adjusted her earrings in a mirror, unaware that the man who had been sending her flowers under a false pretense was married to the very founder whose company had given her a career. She believed she was simply talented, chosen, wanted. She had no idea she was being used as a weapon in a war she did not know existed, between a husband who thought he was untouchable and a wife who had been watching in silence for months. Vanessa smiled at her reflection, thinking about the biggest night of her career. She had no idea she was about to become the center of someone else's reckoning. Julian checked the giant screen one final time, satisfied with what he believed was a career-defining surprise for the woman he loved in secret. He did not know that surprises can move in more than one direction. He did not know that his wife, the one he thought was safely seated somewhere in the crowd, had already discovered everything: the affair, the flowers, the campaign he pushed behind the scenes to elevate a woman who had no idea whose empire she was standing inside. He believed he was in control of the next 10 minutes. He was about to find out that control had never truly belonged to him. What Julian did not understand, what he could not have understood, was that his wife had spent 12 years building something no one could take from her, precisely because no one knew it was hers. Adriana Cole had learned early in her career that a woman's success is often stolen the moment people discover who stands behind it. So she disappeared into the shadows of her own creation, let the world believe someone else was responsible, and protected her name the way other people protect their children. Tonight, for the first time in 12 years, she was done hiding, and her husband, standing confidently near the runway entrance, had no idea the woman he underestimated was seconds away from reclaiming everything he thought he had erased. To understand how a man could stand inside his own wife's empire without ever knowing her name was carved into its foundation, you have to understand who Julian Cole believed himself to be. He was a man who prided himself on reading people, on knowing exactly what was happening around him at all times. In his career, in his friendships, even in his marriage, Julian assumed he was the one holding the map, while everyone else wandered blindly. That assumption was about to be shattered in the most public way possible, in front of 900 strangers who would remember his face for years to come, whether he wanted them to or not. The questions that matter here are not complicated, but the answers took 12 years to arrive at. Why did Adriana Cole choose to erase her own name from the company she built from nothing? What made her decide, after over a decade of silence, that tonight was the night to stop hiding? And perhaps most painfully, did Julian ever suspect, even for a moment, that the woman modeling for his wife's brand was the same woman he had been secretly pursuing behind closed doors? These are not simple questions of coincidence. They are questions about how easily people convince themselves they are invisible, right up until the lights come on. There is one more question sitting beneath all of this, quieter than the others but far more dangerous. What happens to a marriage built on two people who each believed they were the only one keeping secrets? Julian thought his affair was his alone to manage, contained, controlled, invisible to the woman he came home to every night. He had no idea that his wife's silence was not ignorance, it was strategy. And in 10 minutes, on a stage in front of everyone who mattered to both of them, that strategy was about to become impossible to ignore. Adriana Cole grew up watching her mother's talent disappear into other people's names. Her mother had been a seamstress in a small Ohio town, gifted enough to design gowns that wealthy women wore to charity galas, yet never once credited for the work. The dresses were always attributed to the boutique owner, a man who took the praise while Adriana's mother worked late into the night at a sewing machine in their kitchen. Adriana watched this happen for years, and somewhere in that repetition, a decision formed inside her that she would carry for the rest of her life. If she ever built something of her own, no one would ever be able to take the credit, because no one would even know it belonged to her until she decided to tell them. She moved to New York at 22, with almost nothing, a portfolio of sketches, and a stubborn refusal to let anyone define her worth before she had the chance to prove it herself. For years she worked anonymously, designing under contract for larger houses, watching other names get placed on collections she had built from the ground up. It was during this period that she met Julian, a marketing associate at a mid-sized agency, charming in the easy way that ambitious young men often are, confident that his charisma would eventually translate into the kind of success he believed he deserved. Adriana found him refreshing at first, someone who made her laugh after long days of being overlooked. She never imagined that the pattern she grew up watching, talent overshadowed by someone else's name, would eventually repeat itself inside her own marriage. When Adriana finally had enough capital and enough courage to launch her own label, she made a decision that would define the next 12 years of her life. She would not put her name on the company. Instead, she created a holding structure so complex that even her closest employees believed the true founder was a reclusive investor who preferred privacy over publicity. Noir Atelier grew slowly at first, then exponentially, becoming one of the most recognized names in luxury fashion within a decade. Analysts speculated about who was really behind it. Journalists tried and failed to trace the ownership. Adriana watched her creation become a $5 billion empire from the safety of total anonymity, and for the first time in her life, no one could take credit for what she had built, because no one knew where to look. Julian, meanwhile, built a career that never quite matched the ambition he carried inside himself. He climbed steadily but unremarkably through marketing roles, always aware that his wife's income far outpaced his own, though he never fully understood where it came from. Adriana told him early in their marriage that her wealth came from a family trust and smart investments, a story vague enough to avoid follow-up questions, specific enough to satisfy his curiosity. Julian accepted this explanation for years, partly because he trusted her, and partly because questioning it might have required him to confront how little he truly understood about the woman he had married. Their home ran smoothly, their lifestyle was comfortable, and Julian filled the quiet gaps in his own sense of purpose by convincing himself that comfort was the same thing as fulfillment. It was at a Noir Atelier launch event, one Julian attended as a guest of a colleague with no idea the company belonged to his own wife, that he first met Vanessa Lane. She was 26, ambitious, newly signed to the agency representing the brand's rising models, and completely unaware that the man complimenting her work that evening was married to the woman who had built the very company giving her a career. Julian was drawn to her immediately, not because anything was missing at home, but because Vanessa represented a version of admiration he had not felt directed at himself in years. She looked at him like his opinion mattered, like his presence in a room changed something. It was intoxicating in the way that attention often is, for people who have quietly stopped feeling seen. Their relationship developed slowly, deliberately, hidden behind late meetings and business trips Julian claimed were work-related. He told himself repeatedly that this was harmless, temporary, something he would end before it became a real threat to his marriage. He never once considered that Vanessa's rising career, the campaigns she was being cast in, the opportunities suddenly appearing in front of her, were connected to a company his own wife controlled from behind a wall of anonymity he had never bothered to question. Julian began quietly using whatever influence his marketing role afforded him to help elevate Vanessa's profile, unaware that every campaign he pushed for, every placement he championed, was happening inside his wife's empire, under her silent, watchful eye. Adriana noticed the shift in her husband months before she found any concrete proof. She noticed the late nights that no longer matched his usual excuses, the way his attention at home had grown distracted, distant, performative. She was not a woman who acted on suspicion alone, so she waited, watched, and continued running her company with the same discipline she always had. It was an internal expense report, an unremarkable line item for flowers sent to a name she did not recognize at first, that gave her the confirmation she had been quietly bracing herself for. Adriana Cole did not confront her husband that night. Instead, she sat alone in her office, long after her staff had gone home, staring at a name that would soon become impossible to ignore. The months that followed were the most carefully controlled of Adriana's life. She continued attending company functions under her usual guise, a quiet investor with no visible authority, watching from the edges of rooms she technically owned. She watched Vanessa Lane rehearse for campaigns, watched her laugh with photographers and stylists, and felt no anger toward the young woman herself. Vanessa was not the architect of this betrayal. She was simply standing in a room built by two people who had each decided secrecy was easier than honesty. Adriana's focus remained entirely on her husband, on understanding exactly how far he was willing to go, and on deciding what she intended to do about it. Julian, unaware that his wife had discovered anything, grew increasingly bold in his efforts to elevate Vanessa's career. He began attending planning meetings for the label's biggest seasonal show, introducing himself as a marketing consultant brought in to advise on visibility strategy, a title with just enough vagueness to avoid scrutiny. No one questioned his presence too closely, in part because Adriana allowed it. She sat through meetings under her own quiet alias, watching her husband advocate for the woman he was secretly involved with, listening to him describe Vanessa as the future face of the brand, without any understanding of the irony contained in that statement. Every word he spoke in those rooms was being absorbed by the one person he least expected to be listening. The tension inside Adriana during this period was unlike anything she had experienced before. She was a woman accustomed to control, to building empires through patience and precision. Yet here she was, watching her own marriage collapse in slow motion, while maintaining a composure that felt increasingly impossible to sustain. There were nights she considered simply ending things quietly, filing for divorce, walking away without spectacle. But something deeper kept stopping her. A memory of her mother's talent, disappearing into someone else's name, a lifetime spent refusing to let anyone else take credit for what belonged to her. Julian was not just betraying their marriage. He was, without realizing it, attempting to hand her own creation to someone else, using her company as the stage for his secret. The idea for the runway show came to Adriana almost fully formed, arriving in the middle of a sleepless night 3 weeks before the event. She had built her entire company on invisibility, on letting the work speak while she remained unseen. For 12 years, that anonymity had protected her from a world that too often diminished women the moment their success became personal. But watching her husband attempt to elevate his mistress inside the very walls of her empire had shown her something important. Invisibility had protected her career, but it had also allowed the people closest to her to underestimate exactly who she was. Adriana decided, quietly and without telling anyone but her closest confidant, that this show would be the last night anyone underestimated her. Margot Reyes, Noir Atelier's creative director, and the only person alive who knew the full truth of Adriana's ownership, listened carefully as her friend explained what she intended to do. Margot had worked alongside Adriana since the earliest days of the company, long before there was capital or recognition, back when the two of them sketched designs on a second-hand table in a cramped apartment. She understood better than anyone what this company meant to Adriana, and she understood the risk of what her friend was proposing. A public reveal, executed at the exact moment Julian believed he was staging a career-defining surprise for his mistress, was not a decision Adriana was making out of anger. It was a decision about reclaiming a name she had hidden for far too long. Julian, in the final days before the show, made the decision that would ultimately expose everything. Believing the closing segment of the event, a tribute reserved for the company's anonymous founder, was simply an outdated formality no one paid close attention to, he arranged for the portrait displayed during that segment to be quietly swapped. In its place, he had Vanessa's image prepared, framing her as the emerging face of the brand's next era. He believed this gesture would be remembered as visionary, the moment he helped launch Vanessa into a level of stardom she could not have reached alone. He had no understanding that the portrait he was removing belonged to his own wife, or that the woman he was replacing had been watching his every move for months. The night of the runway show arrived, with all the polish and spectacle Noir Atelier had built its reputation on. Photographers lined the entrance, journalists filled the front rows, and industry insiders whispered speculation about the identity of the elusive founder, who had never once appeared publicly in 12 years of the company's existence. Julian arrived early, confident in the plan he had quietly set into motion, believing tonight would mark a turning point in both his secret relationship and his own sense of professional relevance. He had no idea that his wife, dressed simply and seated in an unremarkable section of the venue, was watching him move through the room with the practiced ease of a man who believed he had gotten away with everything. Vanessa Lane prepared backstage with the nervous excitement of a young model on the verge of the biggest moment of her career. She had been told only that a special surprise awaited her during the closing segment, framed by Julian as recognition from the brand itself for her rising talent. She trusted his word completely, unaware that his influence within the company was far smaller than he had presented it to be, and unaware that the woman actually controlling every decision made that night was sitting quietly in the audience, watching preparations unfold with an expression no one backstage could read. Vanessa believed she was about to be celebrated by an industry that had finally recognized her worth. She had no understanding of the storm she was unknowingly standing in the center of. As the show progressed, Adriana remained motionless in her seat, watching collection after collection move down the runway, each design a piece of her own creative history, now walking in front of hundreds of people who had no idea the woman among them had built every thread of it herself. She thought of her mother, of the years spent invisible while others claimed credit for her work, of the choice she had made 12 years earlier to protect her name by hiding it entirely. That choice had served her well, had allowed her empire to grow untouched by the biases that often diminish women the moment their success becomes personal. But tonight, for the first time, she understood that hiding had also allowed her own husband to believe he could use her creation without ever facing her directly. Backstage, Margot Reyes oversaw the final preparations for the closing segment, with a composure that masked the significance of what was about to happen. She had known for weeks that Adriana intended to reveal herself, and she had spent countless hours helping her friend prepare for a moment that would change everything, not just for the company, but for every relationship connected to it. Margot glanced toward the section where Julian stood, satisfied and unaware, then toward Vanessa, adjusting her final look with practiced confidence, then finally toward Adriana, seated quietly among strangers who had no idea they were sharing a room with the most powerful woman in the building. Margot took a breath and gave the signal for the final segment to begin. The screen behind the runway, the one meant to honor the company's anonymous founder in a brief and rarely noticed tribute, flickered to life. Julian watched with quiet satisfaction as Vanessa's image appeared, instead of the generic silhouette audiences had grown accustomed to seeing over the years. He believed this moment would be remembered as the night he helped elevate the woman he loved in secret into a new level of recognition. What he did not understand, what he could not have understood from where he stood, was that removing that image had done something far more significant than promoting his mistress. It had erased, publicly and unmistakably, the one symbol that had protected his wife's anonymity for over a decade. Adriana felt something settle inside her as she watched her own portrait disappear from the screen, replaced by the face of the woman her husband had been secretly pursuing for months. There was no anger visible on her face, no dramatic reaction for the cameras scattered throughout the room. Instead, there was a quiet, deliberate calm, the calm of a woman who had spent 12 years preparing, without fully realizing it, for exactly this moment. She rose slowly from her seat, smoothing the fabric of a dress she had designed herself years earlier, and began walking toward the edge of the runway, while the audience around her murmured in confusion, unsure of what they were witnessing, or why the atmosphere in the room had shifted so suddenly. Julian noticed the movement in his periphery before he understood what he was seeing. A woman moving with quiet purpose toward the runway, unremarkable in appearance to everyone else in the room but instantly, sickeningly familiar to him. His stomach dropped before his mind fully processed why. It was Adriana, his wife, walking toward a stage she had no business walking toward, unless she had some connection to the event no one, including him, had ever suspected. For one disorienting moment, Julian told himself there had to be an explanation, a friend who worked for the company, an invitation extended through someone else. That fragile explanation collapsed the moment Margot stepped forward and addressed the crowd, her voice carrying clearly through the sound system. Margot introduced Adriana not by a title borrowed from someone else, not as a guest or an investor, but as the founder of Noir Atelier, the woman who had built the company from nothing over 12 years, while remaining entirely unseen by the industry she had come to define. A ripple of astonishment moved through the audience, journalists reaching for phones, photographers repositioning instantly, industry veterans turning to each other in disbelief as the anonymous founder they had speculated about for over a decade finally stepped into the light. For most of the room, this was the shocking reveal of the evening, a mystery solved after years of quiet fascination. For Julian, sitting frozen in his seat, it was the collapse of every assumption he had built his double life on. Adriana reached the edge of the runway and turned to face the crowd, her expression steady, composed, entirely unlike the private uncertainty she had carried for weeks leading up to this moment. She thanked the audience for their years of support for a brand many of them had worn without ever knowing her name, and she spoke briefly about the reasons behind her anonymity, about watching her mother's talent disappear into someone else's credit, about building something no one could take from her precisely because no one knew where to look. The room listened in captivated silence, unaware that somewhere in that same crowd sat the husband whose secret affair had quietly accelerated the timeline of a reveal Adriana had been planning for months. Vanessa Lane stood backstage in stunned confusion, watching the scene unfold on a monitor connected to the runway cameras. She had believed, only moments earlier, that this segment was designed to celebrate her rising career. Instead, she was witnessing the public unmasking of the true founder of the company that had given her every opportunity she had built her name on. A founder whose husband, she now understood with rising horror, was the same man who had spent months quietly courting her, sending flowers, encouraging her career, promising her a future neither of them fully understood the cost of. Vanessa felt the ground shift beneath her professional identity as pieces she had never thought to question suddenly connected into a picture she wished she had seen sooner. Julian sat motionless as recognition spread through the crowd around him, some now glancing between him and the runway with dawning curiosity, aware that his last name matched the woman standing under the lights. He understood, with sickening clarity, that his wife had known about the affair, had likely known for some time, and had allowed him to continue believing he held control over a situation she had actually been orchestrating from a position of complete authority. Every campaign he thought he championed for Vanessa, every meeting he attended believing his influence mattered, had occurred entirely within his wife's silent awareness. He had not been managing a secret. He had been performing one, in front of an audience that included the one person he most needed to remain unaware. Adriana did not look toward her husband as she finished addressing the crowd, though she was fully aware of exactly where he sat. She had rehearsed this moment countless times in her mind over the preceding weeks, imagining anger, imagining confrontation, imagining the satisfaction of watching him understand the depth of what he had underestimated. Standing there in the actual moment, she felt something quieter than anger, something closer to clarity. 12 years of hiding had protected her career from a world too often eager to diminish women the moment their success became personal. But it had also allowed the people closest to her to believe they understood her completely, when in truth, she had been the one holding every piece of the picture the entire time. Margot guided the closing moments of the event with practiced professionalism, allowing Adriana the space to step back from the spotlight without appearing rushed or reactive. As the crowd began to disperse into a flurry of conversation, speculation, and hurried journalism, Adriana made her way backstage, passing Vanessa without a trace of hostility in her expression. She understood, perhaps better than anyone in that building, what it meant to be used as a piece in someone else's carefully hidden agenda. Vanessa opened her mouth to speak, uncertain what words could possibly address the situation, but Adriana simply offered a brief, measured acknowledgement, one professional to another, before continuing toward the private exit reserved for company leadership. Julian found his wife nearly 20 minutes later, standing alone near the loading entrance where cars waited to take departing guests home. He approached with the desperate urgency of a man attempting to salvage something he was only now beginning to understand had already been decided without him. He spoke quickly, apologies tangled with explanations, explanations tangled with excuses, none of it landing the way he intended. Adriana listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable, until he finally ran out of words to offer. She told him, calmly and without raising her voice, that she had known for months, that she had watched him elevate the woman he was betraying her with, inside the very company he never bothered to ask her about, and that his ignorance had never been her responsibility to correct. In the weeks that followed, the story of Noir Atelier's anonymous founder dominated headlines across the fashion industry and well beyond it. Adriana's decision to reveal herself was praised as a bold reclamation of a legacy she had built entirely on her own terms, and interest in the brand surged as consumers connected, for the first time, a face and a story to the label they had worn for years. Vanessa's career, ironically, continued to rise, though not in the direction Julian had once imagined orchestrating. She distanced herself publicly from the scandal, choosing instead to let her professional work speak for itself, aware that her association with Julian had nearly cost her a reputation she had worked years to build. Julian's own life unraveled with far less grace. The marriage he had quietly taken for granted ended not with prolonged conflict, but with the same quiet efficiency Adriana had applied to building her empire. She did not need dramatic confrontation to close this chapter. She needed only the truth, finally spoken aloud, and the confidence that came from 12 years of proving to herself she never required anyone else's permission or protection to succeed. Julian was left to reckon with the uncomfortable realization that the woman he had underestimated for over a decade had been, the entire time, the most powerful person in every room he ever walked into beside her, including the one where he thought he was staging a secret of his own. Adriana Cole did not build Noir Atelier to punish anyone. She built it because she refused to let her talent disappear the way her mother's had, absorbed into someone else's name, someone else's credit, someone else's story. What happened on that runway was never truly about revenge. It was about a woman finally choosing to stand in the light she had spent 12 years earning, on her own terms, in her own time, answerable to no one who had failed to see her clearly. The question the story leaves behind is not whether Julian deserved what unfolded that night. It is whether anyone who truly loves someone can afford to stop paying attention long enough to stop truly seeing them. Every story like this one leaves behind a question worth sitting with. Was Adriana Cole right to hide her success for 12 years to protect it? Or did that same silence cost her something she can never fully get back? Would you have made the same choice in her position? Or would you have revealed the truth long before a runway show forced your hand? Let us know in the comments what you would have done differently, and whether you believe Julian ever truly deserved to know the woman he underestimated for over a decade. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, wait until you hear what happens in our next case. A story about a business partner who discovered the fortune he thought he built alone actually belonged to someone he never suspected. It is a story about trust, betrayal, and the moment the truth finally comes due. Make sure you are subscribed so you never miss it. And if you enjoyed this story, give it a like and share it with someone who loves a real story about the price of secrets. We will see you in the next one.